I remember the exact moment everything changed. I was sitting in my truck, engine off, just looking at the driveway. The maple tree out front had already started turning that deep orange red that only happens in Ontario in late September. I had just turned 62. My knees ached in the cold the way they never used to, and I thought, for just a moment, that maybe this was finally the beginning of something good. The house was mine. Not ours. Mine. I want to be clear about that from the start, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I had spent 34 years working in industrial maintenance, the kind of work that leaves its marks on you, calluses that never fully soften, a lower back that reminds you of every wrong lift. I had saved carefully, lived simply, and 3 years after my first wife passed, I sold the property up near Sudbury and bought a proper house in a quiet neighborhood outside of Hamilton. 4 bedrooms, a double garage, a small workshop in the back where I planned to spend my retirement building things with my hands instead of fixing other people's machinery. I paid for it outright. $410,000. No mortgage. I wrote the check myself, and I remember my hand was steadier than I expected. I met my wife, I'll call her Diane, at a community supper at St. Andrews. She was 54 at the time, warm in the way that catches you off guard, the kind of person who remembers what you ordered at a restaurant 3 weeks later. We dated for nearly 2 years before I proposed. I was careful. I had been careful about everything since losing my first wife. Careful felt like the responsible thing to be. What I was not careful enough about was the family she came with. Her younger sister, I'll call her Renee, had been living with Diane before we married. That was the first thing. Diane explained it gently, over coffee one evening in her apartment, that Renee had been going through a difficult stretch. A separation of her own. Some financial trouble. Just temporary, Diane said. She's getting back on her feet. I said I understood. I did not yet understand what I was agreeing to. When Diane and I married, a small ceremony, immediate family only, a Saturday afternoon in April, the plan was that Renee would have found her own place within 3 months. Diane had said this clearly. Renee had agreed. Her mother, I'll call her Lorraine, had been staying with Renee at the time, in a rental across town, so that situation seemed separate from ours. It was not separate for long. By the time we returned from our week in Prince Edward Island, Renee had already moved a second set of boxes into the bedroom at the end of the hall. 2 weeks after that, Diane mentioned, almost in passing, that her mother's rental had fallen through and that Lorraine would be staying with us just for a little while, until things sort themselves out. I want you to understand that I did not make a scene. That is not who I am. I have always believed that marriage requires patience, and that patience sometimes means holding your reaction until you can examine it clearly. So I said very little. I quietly took note. Lorraine arrived on a Tuesday in May with 4 suitcases and a small dog I had not been told about. She walked through my front door, looked around the house I had bought, and said, "It'll do." That was her greeting to me. Not thank you, not hello. It'll do. Within a month, the 3 of them had established a rhythm that did not include me. Dinner was made without consulting me. Plans were discussed in the kitchen in lowered voices that went quiet when I walked in. The workshop I had been so excited about sat untouched because the garage had become a place where Renee stored furniture she didn't have room for in her bedroom. The spare room I had intended for when my own son visited from Calgary became what Lorraine called her sitting room. I called my son, I'll call him Patrick, once a week. He was 38, working in oil and gas, busy with his own life. I didn't want to burden him with every detail, but I started taking notes, small things, dates, observations, things that were said, old habit from my working years. When something goes wrong in a mechanical system, you document before you act. You don't start pulling parts before you understand what you're looking at. Diane and I had been married 11 months when I noticed the first thing that was more than inconvenient. I had gone to check on my online banking, something I did every 2 weeks. Routine, and I noticed a withdrawal I didn't recognize. Not enormous, $340, but from our joint household account, which we had set up for shared expenses like utilities and groceries. The description read only e-transfer. I waited until that evening and asked Diane about it casually. She said it was for something Renee needed, a deposit for a course she was thinking of taking. She'd meant to mention it. I said I understood. I made a note. Over the following 6 weeks, I counted 4 more similar withdrawals. $220, $180, $415, $290. Each one explained away after the fact. Each one for something that was always almost a need, never quite a luxury, always for Renee or Lorraine. Always mentioned only when I asked. I did not confront Diane about the pattern, not yet. I moved a larger portion of my personal savings to an account she didn't have access to, and I said nothing. The second thing happened in August. I had been meaning to call the previous owner of the house a retired man, mid-70s, who had moved to be closer to his daughter and Barry. We had met briefly at the closing, and he had been pleasant. His name was Gerald Kowalski, and he had built the workshop himself, which gave us something to talk about for 20 minutes in the front hallway while the lawyers sorted paperwork. He'd mentioned that if I had any questions about the property, I was welcome to call. I wasn't planning to call him, but he called me. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late August, just before 4. I was in the garage trying to organize what space Renee had left me when my cell phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Something made me answer it anyway. "Is this Douglas?" he said. He had a slow, deliberate way of speaking, the kind that tells you the person on the other end is choosing words carefully. I said yes. There was a pause. "This is Gerald Kowalski. I sold you the house on Sycamore Crescent." I said of course. I remembered him and asked if everything was all right. Another pause. Longer this time. "I'm not entirely sure how to tell you this," he said. "I want to do right by you because I think you'd want to know. I found out recently that I still had a camera connected in the house. In the ceiling of the main floor hallway, near the thermostat, it was part of a security system I'd set up years ago. My son installed it. I disconnected what I thought was everything before the sale, but this one was still active, still uploading to a cloud account under my email. I stood very still in the middle of the garage. I only noticed it by accident," Gerald continued. "I was cleaning out old accounts, and there it was. Months of footage. I looked at enough of it to understand what was happening, and I thought you should know." I asked him what he saw. He was quiet for a moment. "Things being removed from your house, boxes, small furniture, your wife and the 2 women with her. Loading things into a car on days when I'm assuming you weren't home." I sat down on the step at the side door of the garage. "There's more," Gerald said carefully. "Conversations. I couldn't hear everything, but I could see. The way things were discussed. The way they'd look at the front door before going to certain rooms. I don't want to tell you your business, Douglas, but if this were my house and my family, I'd want to know." I thanked him. I asked if he would be willing to give me access to the footage, or at minimum to preserve it. He said yes, without hesitation. He said he had already saved a copy to a drive, just in case. We arranged to meet the following Friday in Barry. He drove me to a Tim Hortons near his daughter's neighborhood, and we sat across from each other at a corner table. He handed me a USB drive without ceremony. He said, "I hope it helps you." That's all he said. No drama, no questions, just the simple, decent thing. I did not watch the footage that night. I drove home, said hello to Diane in the kitchen, ate dinner, and watched the news. I put the USB drive in the breast pocket of my jacket and left the jacket hanging in the closet in my workshop. I called my son that Saturday morning. Patrick listened without interrupting, which is something he has always been good at. When I finished, he said, "Dad, don't do anything until you've talked to someone." By someone, he meant a lawyer. He was right. I found a family law lawyer in Hamilton, a woman with 20 years of experience in exactly this kind of situation. I'll call her my lawyer and leave it at that. She reviewed everything, the bank records I printed, my personal notes with dates and amounts, and then, on a Thursday afternoon in her office, with the blinds half drawn, she watched a portion of what was on the USB drive. She didn't say much when it was over. She looked at me and said, "You've been very patient, Douglas." I said I'd had a good teacher. My father always told me, "Never pull a lever you're not ready to hold." What the footage showed was methodical. On 6 separate occasions over approximately 3 months, items were removed from my house while I was at work. Not large pieces, they were careful about that, but things with value. A set of tools I had not yet noticed missing because I hadn't gone looking. A small antique cabinet from the upstairs hall that I had inherited from my parents, which Diane had once suggested might look nice in Renee's room. Boxes of items from the spare bedroom, packed neatly. The most damaging footage, legally speaking, was a conversation audible in part that took place in the kitchen. The camera did not cover the kitchen directly, but it caught the hallway adjacent, and voices carried. Lorraine's voice was the clearest. She was describing something in the house. She used the phrase "before he catches on." Diane responded, and while her words were less clear, her nod was visible when she crossed the hall briefly into the camera's view. My lawyer said, "This is enough." I did not come home that evening and confront them. I did not raise my voice. I did not change the locks in the night. I did what my lawyer advised. I spent the next 3 weeks documenting what remained in the house, room by room, with photographs and a written inventory. I identified what was missing. I contacted my bank and restructured everything so that the joint account contained only what was needed to cover shared bills while the matter was being prepared. I called Patrick and told him what was coming. He offered to fly in from Calgary. I told him it wasn't necessary yet, but that I appreciated it more than I could say. It was a Tuesday in October, almost exactly 1 year to the day from when I had first sat in my truck looking at that maple tree when my lawyer served the papers. I was not home when it happened. I had gone for a long drive along the escarpment. I needed to be somewhere quiet and open, somewhere I could see a distance. The leaves were past peak by then, more brown than orange, but there was something still good about them. Honest, I suppose. Things that change when they're supposed to. My lawyer called me at 2:30. She said it had been done. I drove back slowly. When I came home, the house was very quiet. Diane was sitting in the living room. Renee and Lorraine were not visible, but I could hear movement upstairs. Diane looked at me with something I could not quite name, not anger, not guilt, something more complicated than either. She started to speak. I said, "My lawyer will be in touch with yours." I went to my workshop. I closed the door. What followed was a process, and I'll tell you it was not fast or easy. Divorce never is, even when you're prepared, even when you have every piece of evidence organized in a binder with dates and tabs. There were phone calls I didn't want to make, evenings that felt longer than they had any right to be, and one Sunday morning where I sat in the workshop for 3 hours and didn't build a single thing. But I had something that many people in my situation do not have: clarity. I knew what had happened. I had documentation. My lawyer was thorough and experienced. And Gerald Kowalski, a man I had spoken to for 20 minutes at a house closing, had done me a kindness I will not forget. The legal outcome was what my lawyer had projected. Because the house was purchased before the marriage, paid in full from assets I had accumulated prior to the relationship, and because I had clear records proving this, my home remained mine. The joint account was reconciled. The missing property was assessed and included in the settlement. Renee and Lorraine were out of my house within 30 days of service. Diane was gone by the end of November. That first December alone was unusual, quieter than I expected, in a way that was sometimes hard and sometimes a relief. Patrick flew in for Christmas and stayed for 9 days. We built a small bookcase together in the workshop. Maple wood, 3 shelves, simple dovetail joints. We talked more in those 9 days than we had in the 2 years before. That was an unexpected gift, one I hadn't known I needed. There are things I've thought about since then, things I've turned over carefully in the long evenings. I think about the fact that the house is still standing. The maple tree out front turned again this past September, the same deep red, without any instruction from anyone. It just did what it was designed to do. There is something in that worth remembering. I think about Gerald, about what it cost him to make that call. He didn't know me. He had no obligation. He could have deleted the footage and gone on with his retirement and never thought about it again. But he didn't. He did the harder, more decent thing. I wrote him a letter, a real one, on paper, and I thanked him properly. He sent back a card that said only, "Glad it helped. Take care of that workshop." I have the card on the shelf above my workbench. I think about the people who are in a situation like mine and have no Gerald, no footage, no record, who have been patient and careful and documented everything and still come to the table with less than they deserve because they were trusting when they should have been watchful. If you are someone who is just beginning to notice things that don't add up, the small withdrawals, the quiet conversations that stop when you walk in, the things that seem to go missing and are explained away with half an answer, I want to say this to you clearly, from someone who has been exactly where you are. Document everything, not to be suspicious, not to live as though everyone around you is a threat, but because documentation is the language that the people and institutions who can help you actually understand. A feeling is not evidence. A date and a bank record and a photograph is evidence. Keep them, do not confront before you are ready. Confrontation without preparation gives the other side time to prepare. 2. Patience, when used deliberately, is not passivity. It is strategy. Find the right lawyer before you need one urgently. Ask around. Get a referral. Sit in that office before the crisis and understand what your rights actually are, not what you assume them to be. In Canada, the rules around property, cohabitation, and marriage vary between provinces, and what you don't know can genuinely cost you. And this, be careful about who you bring into your home, and in what capacity, and with what agreement. Generosity is a virtue, but generosity without clarity is an invitation to misunderstanding at best, and to exploitation at worst. If someone is going to live in your home, there should be a conversation, honest and specific about what that means, how long it lasts, and what the expectations are on all sides. That conversation is not unkind. The absence of it is. The last thing I want to say is this. I am 63 years old. I have survived 34 years of industrial work, the loss of a wife I loved, a remarriage that ended in betrayal, and a legal process that required more of me than I expected. My knees still ache. The lower back is not getting better. But I wake up in a house that is mine, that I earned, that no one can take from me. I drink my coffee in the morning at the kitchen table by the window that faces the maple tree, and I listen to the quiet, and I think, not without some difficulty, but genuinely, that I am all right. The workshop has shelves now. Patrick's bookcase is in the corner. I am building a small cedar chest next, and I am taking my time with it because for the first time in a while, I have time to take. The most permanent revenge is not the legal outcome, though that matters. It is the long, quiet morning on the other side of it. It is getting up and walking to the window and seeing the tree and knowing the house is still yours. That's the thing they never counted on, that I would still be standing here and that I would be all right.